Let's start by discussing the process through which you determine the overall direction for an album these days, and then have that lead into how you pursued where you went with the overview.
The first thing, of course, is to find something I've not done before. And that's very, very important to me each time is to feel like there's going to be a reason for me to add to my already substantial catalogue. Why am I releasing a record? Why am I releasing another record? What's going to make this record have a reason to exist, in the oeuvre? What justifies it being added to the oeuvre? So that's really the number one thing for me these days. I mean, I love to have a concept. I love to have some kind of framework, not just that the album will exist inside, but also the discussion about the album and the tour, and all the artwork. So obviously there's a very strong one this time. And those things don't come along easily. It's nice when something this strong kind of falls into your lap, and the more you kind of think about it and the more you work on it, the more possibilities it suggests. So that's kind of what's happened this time. There's been a bit of serendipity involved as well. The book that's just won the Booker Prize is about exactly the same thing here. So there seems to be a bunch of people thinking about this idea of perspective, with using kind of space as the prism through which we observe ourselves. So that was a really strong concept that kind of presented itself to me. And I had the title and I had the idea before I'd written a single note of music, and that's unusual for me. And that's probably one of the reasons why this album comes relatively hot on the heels of Harmony Codex. I mean, 18 months is nothing these days. It used to be, when you and I were growing up, we expected a new record by our favorite artists every 12 months. But clearly, 21st century, that's no longer the case. I think 3 or 4 years is more like the norm these days. So 18 months is pretty quick to turn around a new record. And that was testament to the strength of the concept and the fact that the concept also suggested a different approach this time, the long form. And I hadn't really done anything in the long form, certainly as a solo artist, I hadn't done anything in the long form for a while. So that was also a challenge. What can I do? What can I do that would be different to what I've done in the long form before? In that sense, yeah.
Well, you previously said, and a lot of people have said this, that writing a long form piece can actually be relatively easier than writing a concise pop song. How does that sort of thesis apply in terms of what you did here?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was easier because, firstly, the first side of the record, for example, I do think of the album as two sides, old school vinyl. The first side is pretty much all derived from, not all of it, but about 70% of it's derived from a single 19 note sequence and bass line that goes with that 19 note sequence. And so you hear the same music material um, interpreted, like in the classical form, what Wagner would have called, a leitmotif, or what Stockhausen would have called a formula, that idea of variations on a theme. So you're not having to reinvent the wheel with every piece of music you write. You've essentially already established, the harmonies and the melodies that you're going to use, and it's just a question of how many different ways can you approach it. That's what Mike Oldfield was very good at, for example. Two or three melodies explored in any number of different ways, and so in that sense, it's a little bit easier because you're not starting with a blank page every time you come to write a piece of music. It's like, where does this movie go next? Where does this novel go next? I've established my characters. I've established the scenario. What's going to happen to my characters next? Um, so that probably made it a little bit easier this time.
Now, how familiar were you with Frank White's work ahead of diving so deeply into this subject area?
Not at all. I'd never heard of him until somebody said, "Oh, there's this guy that came up with the term, the overview." In fact, even the person that told me about it didn't know that it came from him originally. I've only found that out subsequently. But I mean, the overview, I mean, regardless of what you call it, um, the overview effect has obviously, as a kind of concept, has been around for, well, since human beings have walked the earth. You know, that sense of awe you experience when you get a sense of perspective. And that could be gazing into the Grand Canyon. I was in Chile a couple of weeks ago in the Atacama Desert, and I had a similar kind of feeling there, you know, sense of awe at the, you know, a sense of perspective, a sense of my own insignificance. So that kind of feeling, that effect, what we now call the overview effect, which, as I learned later, was a term that was coined by Frank White, is something I think we experience throughout our life in different moments, in different contexts. That kind of very profound feeling of awe, you know, at the sheer magnitude and size of the universe and our insignificance in relation to that.
Does any of this relate to your childhood in terms of interest in space, interest in the stars, interest in the bigger picture? A lot of us as kids, instead of staring at screens and devices as we do today, we'd look up into the sky and ponder it and perhaps ponder our place within it.
It's not something that comes from my childhood. I think it's something that comes from all of our childhoods. Anybody of my generation remembers growing up with, you know, the fascination with space, science fiction, space movies, programs about space, the sky at night we had here in the UK. And before the days of screens, we used to be out with our friends in on warm summer evenings, gazing up at the sky, gazing up at the stars. In the days when you could still see stars, even if you lived in a town, you could still see a lot of the stars. Nowadays, it's very hard to see any stars in the sky because there's so much ambient light that comes from the places we live in, certainly in the towns and the cities. So I certainly remember that, yeah. And I remember seeing movies like 2001 and Solaris when I was young, Close Encounters of the Third Kind when I was young. There seemed to be generally more of an interest in space. I mean, that's kind of how the album opens. So it opens with this scene, you know, meeting an alien on the moor and the alien saying, you know, did you forget about us? You know, you're so busy looking down into your digital devices, you don't not only look up, look around. You don't look around anymore either. You don't even look at your own planet. And it is a stunningly beautiful planet, regardless of what we do to it. It is a stunningly beautiful planet and incredibly diverse, you know. Somebody said to me the other day, would you rather live on Mars? And I'm like, well, Mars is just a sort of planet of red dust. Our planet is incredibly diverse, you know, geographically, ecologically, climate-wise, it's incredibly diverse, even though it's very small, relatively speaking. It's such a beautiful place. So I think it's not only the looking up, it's the looking around that I kind of feel like we're missing out on these days.
You ever suggest this perspective to your own kids?
All the time. It's a battle. I'm sure you have it, you know, with your son as well. It's a battle just to get them off their phones sometimes. It is a very worrying trend in human evolution. I'm sure we talked about this before because, you know, I talked about this with Future Bites and some of it earlier, even fear of going back as far as Fear of a Blank Planet, how human evolution has been almost thrown off its trajectory by digital devices and specifically social media.
What about the fascist descent our civilization has taken in recent years? How do you feel that's affected our sense of wonder, you know, as it relates to the cosmos and the bigger picture?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's many things there that kind of all feed into this. You know, that's another thing. AI is another thing. The very sort of existential issue of whether human beings still have a role to play. Certainly, I feel that very, you know, very strongly being a musician these days. I think one of the things that musicians will always end up talking about when they meet these days, inevitably, is the prospect of artificial intelligence and how that's going to affect the human race. You know, the whole Skynet thing. And yeah, I mean, it's, you know, that's the whole thing about the overview effect is that when you see the Earth from space, having not experienced it myself, I can't say for sure, but this seems to be the way people kind of experience it, is that all of those things like borders melt away. The presence of human beings largely melts away when you see the Earth from space. It is a very beautiful um, place that has no human presence at all when you see it far enough away. Um, all those kind of petty squabbles, politicians, psychopaths, sociopaths. Yeah, it's a very concerning time we're living through. Seems to get worse by the day as well.
Do you have any aspirations yourself for a journey into space as a space tourist? It does exist as a possibility.
I think I would find it hard to say no if the opportunity ever came up. I mean, it won't, but I have a notorious fear of flying, so it would be terrifying for me in some respects. But I think it would be too good an opportunity to pass up, wouldn't it?
How do you handle this extensive touring you do with this fear of flying?
I have to take pills. I have to take pills. Every time I can, I go by train. So I go Eurostar if it's Paris, Amsterdam. I go Eurostar by the train. If I have to fly, I have to take something to sedate me, sadly.
Well, of course, you're an atheist, but you're also someone that believes spirituality can coexist with that perspective. Talk about the spiritual and existential perspectives embodied in this album as it relates to that.
I think it all comes down to me to the sheer numbers. The numbers are almost inconceivably large to the point that you almost can't hold them in your mind. Um, just absurd. I mean, absurd distances, and not just distances, actually, the whole sort of temporal aspect as well, you know. I mean, there are trillions of galaxies, trillions of planets in every galaxy. All the grains of sand on Earth, summed up, one grain of sand is equivalent to about 1 billion planets that there are in the universe. I mean, those kind of numbers are just mind-blowing. If somebody was waving to us now from Andromeda, which is the nearest galaxy to us, 2.5 million light years away, if they were looking down at us now, would they be seeing you and me? No, they'd be seeing Stone Age man crawling out of caves and fashioning tools from bones. That's our nearest galaxy, nearest neighbor in terms of the sort of length of time is also mind-blowing. The amount of time that light has taken to reach our eye when we look up into the sky and see stars that are millions of light years away. We're seeing them as they were millions of years ago. I mean, those things are mind-blowing. How can you possibly still hold this idea of God in your mind? I find it very hard to understand how someone could, cling on to that idea. It is a very profound feeling of insignificance, but you know what? I always try and look at these things in a very positive frame of mind. If you acknowledge to yourself there is no God, if you acknowledge to yourself that life is just a blink of an eye, if you acknowledge to yourself that the universe doesn't care about you, that you are completely insignificant, you're a blip on a blip on a blip on a blip, that's actually a kind of beautiful thing to acknowledge to yourself, and just sort of say to yourself, well, enjoy the ride, enjoy the ride. This is meaningless. This thing, this gift we've been given, this gift of life is meaningless, really. And so if you don't enjoy it, it's very, very tragic, I feel. And I understand that not everyone is in a position to enjoy it. I understand that, so but anyway, that's kind of the way I look at it.
There are some thematic extensions from the Harmony Codex on the overview. I'm curious what continuum you see from that record to this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Musically, it feels like the next logical step from Harmony Codex. Harmony Codex was really me, perhaps for the first time, drawing on all the different aspects of my musical personality without any degree of being self-conscious about it or trying too hard to think about what I was doing, just allowing all of these things to come in without being aware of any influence really from the outside at all, just creating, electronic, ambient, pop, progressive, metal, jazz, just bringing it all in without being too analytical about it and trying to, second guess what I was doing. And the overview feels like a continuation of that approach, not thinking about what I was doing. Obviously, embracing again the long form, embracing this idea of a movie rather than short stories. Sorry, of a novel rather than short stories, a feature length movie rather than a bunch of, short videos. So it's the long form, but it's kind of a continuation of the same musical vocabulary and musical approach that I kind of arrived at on the Harmony Codex. Um, Lyrically, yeah, possibly. I think in a way, this album is looking at the same subject, but in a more cosmic way. So if Harmony Codex was in a kind of more earthbound way of looking at it, this is a more cosmic perspective, that word again, on similar subject matter. Yeah.
What can you tell me about the creative process for sort of aligning these musical suites to elements of the overview effect? Was it any different from your typical creative process? How do you sort of map it all out?
Well, it's probably the most solo record I've made. I mapped out almost all of it just playing myself. So I played all the bass, I played most of the guitar, most of the keyboard parts myself. And right at the end, then I brought in the kind of solo voices. So Randy to play the solo guitar parts, Adam to play some keyboard parts, and the drummers came in. But other than that, I mean, 80% of the work was just me, um, kind of on a roll, kind of on a roll. And the whole record came together in about 6 to 8 weeks. Once I had the concept, it kind of just flowed out of me. I think I had it pretty much drafted out, and I would say not finished, but the structure was there probably about, yeah, after about 8 weeks of work. So we're going back to March last year now. Kind of all fell into place. So then it was then really a question of bringing in the solo voices and refining and creating the mixes, which were very complex. I think the mix was the most complex part of the process. The actual recording side, the creation of the music, composition and recording side was relatively painless. I wish it was always that way. So quite insular in this way, the actual making of the record, quite a solipsistic or solitary kind of experience for me.
When you're in that zone, do you become very single-minded? Does it become all-consuming and you kind of stay up 24/7 till you get
Oh
it?
no, no,
Yeah.
no, no, not since I had a family. No, no. I mean, I have a fairly strong work discipline, which is I will finish work, in time for dinner with the family every day. But that doesn't mean that the two ideas are mutually exclusive. I had a pretty, let's just say I would go to bed each night pretty much having a good idea where I was going to pick up the next day. So it was, one of the things I think, having made so many records, one of the things that's always a fear, and maybe we've talked about this before, I'm sure we must have done, we've done so many interviews over the years. It is that fear of the blank page. Um, Fear that this is the last record. This is the last record I'm going to make. Fear of that idea that there's nothing more to say after this, and how can I possibly, improve on this, or how can I move sideways from this, or whatever the sentiment is. There's always that fear, and I have that now. I have that now with the overview. It's like, can I follow it? How can I follow this? And I've always managed to prove myself wrong. Um, Sometimes it's been painful to give, without wishing to be pretentious about it, to give birth to the next thing, and sometimes it's been surprisingly effortless. And this definitely would veer more towards the latter. Um, the concept was so strong, and I had such a strong idea in my head straight away for certainly how the first piece was going to unfold. Almost before I'd picked up an instrument, I had this very clear vision. It's going to start, even to the point that I knew it was going to start with a single falsetto voice lost in space. And I've never, you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think I've ever started an album with a single voice before. So even that, I'm thinking, right, okay, great, yeah, that's different. My fans have never heard me do that before. So straight away, I was kind of like on a mission almost. I had these things. We're going to start the album with a single falsetto voice, lost in a big echoey space. We're going to meet this alien on the moor, and the alien's going to say to us, "What happened? Did you forget about us?" I had all of this in my mind, almost like I had a movie script in my mind. And the music was almost like, you know, secondary. The actual creation of the music was secondary. And once I had that basic melody, which is this kind of, the melody is kind of a shepherd tones thing. It's this idea of constantly ascending in whole tones. The bass line constantly ascends in whole tones. I wanted this idea of careering ever further and further away from the earth, out into space, out into the cosmos. So even the line itself has that kind of inbuilt into it, this sense of movement, constant motion, constant movement. Um, so it fell into place very beautifully, yeah.
So a lot of people, of course, have been focusing on the progressive rock element of this record. I hear a whole lot of spiritual jazz influences in it as well. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Electronic, ambient. I think the return to progressive rock is in the idea of the long form. To me, it all comes back to that anyway. What is progressive rock? To me, the only thing all of it really has in common, and I'm talking about the whole spectrum of progressive rock, from Pink Floyd to, Frank Zappa to Rush to whatever, or to Mogwai, to Radiohead, what it all has in common, really, the only thing it has in common, really, is it's a will to move away from the standard pop form. It's a kind of this idea that you can take the listener on a journey and you can surprise them. And very often that involves doing something over a longer period of time. Not always, but a lot of bands obviously veered towards 10, 15, 20-minute long pieces. And that is obviously what this record is. And that I think is one of the hallmarks, if not the preeminent hallmark, of what I think of as progressive rock. But beyond that, as you kind of hinted at, all of my usual things are going on here. There's a piece of electronic music on the record. There's a piece of pure ambient music that finishes the record. There are metal riffs. There are moments with strong pop sensibilities. There are moments of jazz. But I think the overall structure and the overall sense of journey is probably something people would associate with the tradition of progressive rock.
Well, tell me about the process of working with and directing Andy Partridge on Objects Outlive Us.
So when I started making the record, I just finished mixing a record for XTC, an old XTC record called The Big Express. There's a song on that album, which is one of my favorite songs of all time, lyrically just a masterpiece, called The Everyday Story of Small Town. And Andy, for me, is the best at writing about ordinary people living ordinary lives in small British towns. In other words, not London, the small suburban towns where people go about their everyday normal lives, ordinary lives. If that doesn't sound too patronizing, he is the king of that. I mean, I think of him and Ray Davies as being the kings of that kind of observational songwriting. And this one song was fresh in my mind, and I wanted one of the scenes on the first side of the record, one of the scenes on in Objects Outlive Us. I wanted it to be this a song section that would contrast soap operas of everyday life, the little minutiae of everyday life, a husband cheating on his wife, a nurse working in a care home, a young kid starting his first job in a car showroom, etc., with the most massive cosmic phenomena, stars dying, nebulas diving, black holes imploding. And I thought about Andy because he writes those little soap operas better than anyone else I can think of, at least this side of Ray Davies. So I rang him up and said, Andy, I've got a challenge for you. And I said, and I explained the idea to him, and he completely got it. And of course, he did an absolutely beautiful job. So that's the reason. I think it was an obvious thing to do, to ask Andy to do that, because I think that is something he just excels at. Those kind of observational songs are just his forte.
Andy's also an avid UFO enthusiast. How did that sort of drive his perspective?
Well, I don't know. You'd have to ask him. It certainly did. It's funny because we're around the time of To the Bone, we also wrote a song together called How Big the Space, which is also a song which draws parallels or uses kind of space metaphors. And actually, we're putting that as a bonus track on the Digital Deluxe because A, it's never been out on CD before, and secondly, it's almost like a dry run for what we've done on this record. Um, yeah, I mean, he's obviously the perfect person for this situation.
Now, Andy suggested doing a whole album together. Is that something you might contemplate in the future?
I'd love to. Yeah, I'd absolutely love to. Maybe him writing lyrics and me putting them to music. Although he's also a brilliant melodicist, so yeah, I'd love to. I'd love to. I get on really well with Andy. I think Andy is one of those people that has, um, you know, fallen out with a lot of people in his career because he is very like me in the sense he's a control freak. He knows exactly how he wants his songs to be born, and for that reason, I realized early on in my career that I was essentially unproducible. But he was in a situation where he was signed to a major record deal, and they were always putting him with producers that kind of rubbed him up the wrong way. So I kind of get Andy. I understand completely, why he was always feeling this sense of struggle to create this magical thing in the way he heard it in his head. Um, so yeah, that would be an obvious thing to do. Yeah, I've talked about doing something with similar with Roland as well from Tears of Fear. So maybe we'll all get together and do it as a three piece. That'd be amazing.
Could be a new band.
Yeah, super group.
Now, Randy McStine has become an important presence in both your solo work and, of course, with Porcupine Tree. Tell me what you sought from him as a collaborator and the strengths he brings to the table for you.
So what I love about Randy is that he's incredibly a bit like yourself and me. He's very curious about all sorts of music and he absorbs all these different things. And he's very au fait, as you know, because you've spoken to him. He's very au fait with the classic rock tradition, but he's also a brilliant sound designer. Now, I say that because I've worked with some incredible guitar players. I've had the honor to work with some of the best guitar players on the planet, but they weren't always the most imaginative when it came to the actual sound design, the sonic side of things. And sometimes, if you have a particular sound, it changes the way you play. And Randy completely understands that. Now, the example I always give is Robin Guthrie from Cocteau Twins, whose sound was very much predicated on the fact that he would, have be going through all these big echo and reverb pedals, and he would play one note, and he would set off this chain, this glorious cathedral of sound just by playing this one note. And it changes the way you play when you're into this idea of sound sculpting, sound designing, exploring the possibilities of the sonic possibilities of guitar. And Randy completely gets that. He completely gets that. One of the things I enjoyed most about him, his playing on this record, was the big solo at the end of the first side. And I said to him right up front, I said, Randy, we're gonna reinvent the notion of the classic rock guitar solo. We're going to do the not comfortably numb. I love comfortably numb, but it's been done and it's been copied, it's been imitated, not least by the originator himself many times. We're going to do something different. We're going to have a solo, an extended solo, which has the same sense of drama and gravitas and momentum, but we're going to reinvent it. We're going to reinvent the melodic vocabulary and we're going to reinvent the sound approach. And that's the sort of thing I can throw at Randy, and I know he will rise to the challenge. And that's exactly what he did. So that extended solo at the end of the first side, it's not your traditional classic rock epic solo, but at the same time, it kind of is. And so that's the beauty, I think, of working with someone like Randy. He's younger, he's more curious about sound, he's more diverse, more eclectic in his taste. I can talk to Randy about anything from noise music to free jazz. And then he's au fait with people like Bill Nelson and Robert Fripp just as much as he is with Steve Vai and David Gilmour. And that, I think, is his strength. Well, also the fact he's a brilliant technical player as well. He can do all of those things.
You are 17 years into your solo career at this point. I'm curious how you would assess the distance traveled since Insurhantes.
Well, I love the fact that every album in the catalog is different. And you use the phrase distance traveled. It's a phenomenal distance, really, to have come. I mean, I think of albums like The Raven That Refused to Sing and The Future Bites couldn't be more different in a way. But what I love about the whole catalogue is it all sounds like me. And I think this is one thing I've come to understand and accept. And one of the reasons why I think the harmony codex and um, the overview feel like a liberation in a sense is that I've kind of realized reasonably late in my career, you'd think I would have figured it out earlier on, that actually I can do whatever I want and it just ends up sounding like me. And I say that with the caveat that at some point that's probably been frustrating to me. But I embrace it now. I embrace the fact that whatever I do ultimately ends up sounding like me. So I can make a pop record. I can make a more conceptual rock record like this. And ultimately, it just sounds like it's part of the Stephen Wilson catalogue or Stephen Wilson continuum. And of course, that's exactly what I loved about all the artists that were the big influences on me. It's one of those things you don't you're kind of aspiring to something and you almost don't realize that you've arrived there without meaning to. I think in that sense, in my own little way, when I dreamed that one day I might be like a Bowie or a Kate Bush, just creating my own universe, I've kind of done it without realizing, in a way, without being necessarily conscious of it. Except I am beginning to be a little bit more aware of it now. So that whole notion of existing outside of, well, outside of the notion of genre, it almost takes a career to earn that right to say that about what you do. And I feel like a lot of people are kind of acknowledging that about me these days, which is great. Even the people that maybe 5 years ago were still trying to put me in the prog rock, bucket or whatever. I think a lot of them have kind of come around to the idea that I have a sound and I do what I do. And yes, I guess it is in the tradition of progressive rock, but it's also a lot more than that. Yeah. And the journey, as you say, kind of is exhibit number one. Not to mention all the other stuffs that have come alongside it. The last Bass Communion album, the last No Man record, the last PT record, the Storm Corrosion record. These are also all pieces of that jigsaw puzzle in a way.
Well, what do you consider the highs and dare I ask you the lows of your solo career to date?
Releasing an album during COVID, The Future Bites was a low for me. I'm very proud of that record, but it was a very difficult record to put across to the fan base because it was essentially a electronic pop record. From an artist that people predominantly thought of as a rock artist or a prog rock artist. And the timing was so bad because it came out at a time, it was a concept album essentially about marketing myself as a kind of product. The whole concept was about removing the personality from promoting record, releasing a record. It's the last thing people wanted during COVID. They wanted to feel closer together, not alienated by a concept like the Future Bites. So I think artistically, I think of it still as a very successful record. But in terms of promoting it and the timing, it was kind of the low point of my catalogue. Um, I struggled to get the ideas across in that record. Um, High points, my debut, Insurgentes, I still think one of my favourite records. Might still be my favorite record of all, but we'll see. Because right now I'm really proud of the overview, and I'm always proud of the last record I made. Harmony Codex and the overview feel to me like um, I'm reaching some kind of peak. But I'm still very proud of that first record. Very, very proud of that first record. All of the records, to be honest, in their own way, like I say, they all have their place in the catalogue. I think in terms of the struggle of being a solo artist, The Future Bites was the hardest thing to release and promote, partly because of the timing, but also because of the style of music.
You put out a series of Porcupine Tree anniversary and deluxe editions. Have you been contemplating that for your solo work? We're at the point where you probably could do that.
I could, you know what? I could do that. There's been deluxe editions all the way through anyway. I think that's the problem. So there's, right from the beginning of Insurgentes was conceived as a deluxe edition right from the beginning. So that's a problem. What more could you add to a lot of these albums? Unless it's just a question of expanding the extant deluxe editions. Time, Anil. I mean, I'm I'm in a position now where I could very, very easily stop making new music and just spend my whole life curating the back catalogue because that's how big the back catalogue really is. And thankfully, there is always a demand for the back catalogue to be, reanimated, if I can use that word. So there's no shortage of projects that could be done. Been talking with Snapper about Kscope about doing a Porcupine Tree live box set, because pretty much every show that we ever played was recorded in some way. But that's a massive job to go through and maybe compile 12 or 15 shows that represent each phase of the band in the best possible lights. When am I going to do that? When am I going to do that? It's 3 or 4 months work. So I think it's something I will get to eventually, but it will be at a time when I would feel maybe I would take a step back from making new work. And as you see, that ain't happening right now.
Since you mentioned the recent Bass Communion, the itself of itself, why don't you talk a little bit about putting that together?
I hadn't made a bass communion album for 12 or 13 years. And the reason I hadn't is because I looked around at the landscape for ambient and experimental music, and I basically thought to myself, there's enough of it already. There's enough of it already. Do I really need to add to the mountain of it? And I kept coming back to this answer, no, not really. And then after about 12 or 13 years, I was approached by a couple of labels, love to do a bass music album. And I'm like, well, I feel there's already too many people doing that kind of music, ambient, experimental, drone, noise, whatever you want to call it. But I did go to the trouble of I'd amassed quite a large sort of, number of pieces over the 12, 13 years. And I listened through to them all, and I felt there was enough in there that was unique and that was a fresh take or a unique take on experimental music, ambient music. And I felt I could put a good record together. And I do think it's quite a unique take on experimental music. It's quite a noisy one. I think that was something I felt was attractive to me to get away from the notion of, nice ambient and do something a bit more gritty and dirty and using a lot of, audio artifacts like tape hiss, hum, vinyl crackle. I mean, to an extent, I've been interested in those things for a while, but to really focus in on those things to the point where one of the pieces on the album is generated entirely from things like cassette hiss and hum and things like that. And that was interesting to try and find the beauty in ugliness, try and find a balance between the two things. Did the world need it? I don't know, but I'm very proud of that record anyway. And some people seem to appreciate it. The other thing to say about that is it did feed into the overview. There's a lot of the sound design and what I call R&D that went into Bass Communion is very prevalent in the overview. In fact, the first side ends with a piece of music that's also on the Bass Communion album, the atonal orchestral closing section of Objects Outlive Us. You will also hear in a different form on the Bass Communion record. So there is a kind of a sense of it acting almost as R&D for, as there always has been actually. There's a kind of acting as R&D for the song orientated material.
You've publicly dabbled with AI and most prominently on December Skies in 2023, and things have shifted dramatically since then. We've got the emergence of so-called AI artists. We have playlist scandals on Spotify devoted to them. What are your thoughts on what's evolving before our very eyes?
It's probably changed since last night, hasn't it? I mean, that's the point. It's changing all the time. The thing I think about AI, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to explore it on December Skies, is it's not going away. It's clearly not going away. It's only going to get stronger and more prevalent. And I think you can do one of two things as an artist. You can either bury your head in the sand and pretend it doesn't exist, or you can try and find a way to incorporate it into your process. And I think it can be useful. And I also feel like, in a sense, AI has been with us for a long time, in the sense that there have been tools that have helped musicians make music, electronic tools that have helped musicians make music, auto-tune, Melodyne, Beat Detective. These are all forms of artificial intelligence in the way I look at it, in a way. They're things that make you sound better by basically applying these software processes to your performance. They make you sound better. automatically. There's a sense that this is really just the next step in that kind of trajectory. Now, I understand that this is very different because we're actually talking now about this technology eliminating musicians from the process completely. And I think that will also happen. I think generic music that obeys a very, very strict set of parameters and doesn't really break the mold could already be made by AI. Generic techno music could be generated by AI by the yard already. Probably you could say the same of generic metal music, generic country music. I think AI could already generate those things. So this comes to my point really. The role of the artist sometimes, and this may be a kind of silver lining of AI. It will force musicians to focus on what makes them different. What are the quirks? What are the things that AI could never dream up? What are the kind of, I was talking about this the other day with a friend of mine. We were talking about David Lynch having passed away. And his movies are things that AI could never generate because they are full of this kind of dream logic, these kind of jumps in logic that defy logic. And I think that's what musicians also have to kind of now focus on. What are the things that we do that AI would never come up with? I don't think AI could ever have come up with an album like The Overview, at least not now. Maybe in 5 years we'll be having a different conversation. But right now, there's something about The Overview, the way it unfolds, the way it's unpredictable, the way it puts elements together that you wouldn't normally put together, the way it kind of breaks with the parameters of making music. At least that's the way I think about it. Um, that make it something that AI could never come up with. And maybe AI will force musicians, or force not just musicians, but creative people generally, will force creative people generally to break out of the mold, to not make generic music anymore. The world didn't need any more generic music anyway. So now we have AI to do it for us. It needs even less from human beings. So that, I mean, that's kind of trying to put a positive slant on it, which I think it's what I tried to do with December Skies as well. How can I use this in a positive way? And by the way, even in December Skies, that was about 1% of what it generated. 99% of what it generated was shit beyond belief. And I still had to go through, a human being, still had to go through and pick out the bits that were good. And maybe that's also the point.
A lot of focus is put on specifically Spotify and its willing embrace of the so-called AI artist. What if we flip that conversation? What does it say about a society where there are segments of it that are willing to be so completely disinterested in the artist or their story? They're just willing to listen to what's on a playlist and just have it be that and not have any concerns whatsoever about the origins. What do you make
Well,
of that?
that's it. I mean, and that is the doing of Spotify and to a lesser extent social media, because essentially what we've done is we have gradually eroded to the point that it almost doesn't exist anymore. We've eroded this idea of the cult of personality. Now, there's always exceptions to that rule. My kids love Billie Eilish, and she has a very strong personality. But generally speaking, I think kids don't care about the artist anymore, which is completely flipping it from when I was a kid. It was all about the artist. It was all about the cult of personality. It was all about, your loyalty to an artist. What are they going to do next? Are they going to confront your expectations? What's the new album going to be like? And you didn't know until you got it home. So there was always that element of shock and surprise, sometimes disappointment. Sometimes that disappointment, you'd come out the other end and you'd love it because you would force yourself because you had an allegiance to an artist. And that's all gone now. Pretty much that's gone now. Why would you listen to something more than once if you didn't like it the first time? There isn't that kind of loyalty now to an artist, I don't think. And a lot of artists now live and die on whatever their next song is, whatever their next Spotify drop is. Which is why you have a lot of artists now who have got one song which has got 1 billion streams, and the rest of their catalog is just fallen off a cliff. And I think increasingly we're going to see more and more artists that essentially their career will be founded on the idea of the single song, the single breakout hit, the single viral hit. That's sad to me because I love, and I know you do too, I love the idea of a career trajectory. I love the idea of the cult of personality. I love the idea of an artist that will take you on a journey with them, confront your expectations, surprise you, maybe take you places you didn't think you wanted to go, but you'll grow up, you'll end up loving anyway. And unfortunately, the whole notion of social media and Spotify and the playlist culture, I mean, that's the bottom line, really. It's about playlist culture. The whole notion of playlist culture does away with that, and many other things too. I'm sure we've talked before about this whole idea of that the notion of an intro has disappeared. The notion of an instrumental break has disappeared. Solos have disappeared from songs. It's basically all about the lead vocal now. All lead vocal. Or the vocal. There's no musical sort of personality. There's nowhere in modern pop songs where the music becomes the focal point. It's all geared towards the vocal. I think that's very sad. And the overview obviously is a kind of a complete alternative to that way of thinking. There are long passages of instrumental music on this record in the way that I grew up loving, and I know you did too.
Is there a positive side to the AI thing in terms of your work as a surround remixer, as far as automating or enhancing some of that work goes?
It hasn't really helped me yet. I mean, you're talking about stem splitting or the sort of software that can create stems from tracks where multi-tracks are missing, right? As the Beatles famously have done. I mean, the point is at the moment that technology is nowhere near good enough to be much use to me. I think a lot of people, unfortunately, a lot of music fans out there, they've seen the news stories about the Beatles albums and they think you can now play any track into a piece of software and it will generate a pristine multi-track for you. um, no, maybe Peter Jackson's MAL software can do that. Rendering for weeks, multi-billion dollar computer systems rendering for weeks. But the stuff that's out there now is very limited, full of nasty digital artifacts. I've tried it. It's not of any use to me at the moment, sadly. But it would be interesting. But then the other side of that coin is if that technology was available, maybe there'd be no job for me anymore. Anybody would be able to download an app onto their phone and create a multi-track from their favorite song and do their own mix. Why would you need me at that point? So um, there's still a long way to go with AI in terms of that. I think it's to answer your question, AI is already useful. Um, it's useful in the same way that a Rogers Thesaurus was useful. Oh, I want to think of a different word for that, or I've used that word too many times. Let's ask ChatGPT to suggest some alternatives. I use it like that. And by the way, I'm pretty sure almost every songwriter on the planet is doing that right now too. ChatGPT has almost become like a tool, like a dictionary or a thesaurus. I think this circles back to the beginning of this discussion. I think for me, it's a question now of how you incorporate it as an additional tool in your toolbox. And I can see it becoming useful as a tool in my toolbox. But nothing more, nothing more.
On the surround mix front, we have some cases in which you've revisited mixes for King Crimson, and yes, a second time around. And I'm curious how your accumulated experience in advancing technology impacts how you look at these again.
So I think I've learned a lot. It's difficult to articulate exactly, what I've learned, but I've learned an awful lot over the 15 years or so I've been doing this now. I mean, obviously the primary reason to revisit these was because they weren't done in Atmos originally. They were done in stereo and they were done in 5.1. And now the whole music business has got a bit hard on for Atmos. So, which is great for me. I love doing it and it's an opportunity to revisit those mixes and tweak the stereos and 5.1s as well. Um, to some extent, I'm doing as little as possible because it's I think it's easy to sort of for fans to say, what, why have you remixed it again? Does that mean you didn't do it properly in the first place? Which is a very easy criticism to make. I think it's a question of the first time I did Crimson and Yes, I was a little bit less faithful to the original mixes, and now I'm being more faithful to the original mixes. I think I've realized over the years that that is what I prefer to do, to be less revisionist. So I'm going back and tweaking the stereo mixes particularly and the 5/1 mixes to try and get closer to the original mixes, and then and only then breaking it out into Atmos. Yeah.
You've got a couple of Porcupine Tree tunes in progress with Gavin and Richard. What can you tell me about those and also about the future of the band?
It's a bit too early to say, to be honest. It's different again. It's different again. I think a bit like I was talking about with my solo career, I think we've reached a point where we just don't want to try to do anything except be ourselves and not worry about what people expect of us. Not that we ever did, this, but there's always that thing in the back of your mind. And I think it's much less likely to be there now. We're just enjoying the process. I love working with Gavin and Richard. And obviously, the obvious thing for me is that now that the solo career is established, I'm much more able to be part of a democratic band unit in a way that I wasn't back in the day. I felt the need to control it more, and now I don't. In fact, I actually relish the idea of giving up control, and I relish the idea of perhaps not getting my own way all the time and being open to not necessarily doing things that I would have done myself. And that's definitely set the tenor, I think, for the project going forward. I don't think we're going to be incredibly prolific. We may not tour again, but I think we will definitely make at least one more record. Could be the next project, even possibly. But that's as much as I can say really at the moment.
Well, I haven't seen you talk a lot about your perspective on being a vegan. Tell me how that informs your life and what you would like people to know about that.
It's a hard one. I mean, it's funny. I see some people on social media, like somebody like Moby or Billie Eilish, are incredibly aggressive. And I don't mean aggressive, in that sense. I mean like they're very proactive is probably a better word. Very proactive with their sort of sharing their veganism with their fans and their followers. Um, I've always I've always been slightly wary of being too preachy or too holier than thou, with my, or just not even holier than thou, just, trying to suggest that my lifestyle is something perhaps other people should adopt. And there's no reason why they should, except there is. Obviously, there is a reason why they should. It's better for the planet and it's a damn sight better for the animal kingdom. Um, so I've become a little bit more bullish about it. In fact, there's a very strong vegan reference in the lyrics on the new record. I don't know if you picked up on it. Um, but it's quite a brutal one. It doesn't pull any punches. So I'm becoming a little bit more forthright about my veganism. But again, I think social media is full of people that are very belligerent about, their way of life and their ideal for living. And I'm very wary of not being that person. So to me, it's more about just, suggesting the alternatives. And share, if people ask me, I will tell them why I'm a vegan. I'll tell them my experience, and that's what I'm doing basically.
I presume this extends to your family.
So my wife is vegan. My stepchildren are both vegetarian by choice, no influence from us. They're vegetarian because their role models are vegetarian. Billie Eilish is vegetarian. Serena Williams is vegetarian. Um, Emma Watson is vegetarian. Ariana Grande is vegetarian, vegan. In fact, they're all vegans, not vegetarian. So that they have role models these days, which is something I didn't have. We didn't when we were growing up. We didn't have vegan, vegetarian role models. At least I wasn't aware of any. And now kids do. They have a lot of very cool role models, um, which I think is a big change since we were growing up, and that's amazing. So we don't have to force them, we don't influence them. They choose to be vegetarian. They understand They love animals. They understand the implications of eating meat. They understand the implications of the dairy industry too, and they may decide one day that they're going to give that up too, but not yet. That's a choice they may make in the future. And I think that's amazing. It's the one thing I look around at the earth and I think is going in the right direction rather than the wrong. Everything looks like it's going in the wrong direction, except that I do think we are becoming more aware of you know, a lot more restaurants, a lot more restaurants are offering vegan alternatives, which are good. A lot more wholly vegan or wholly vegetarian restaurants opening up all over the world. It's been amazing to see that happen over the last, really only over the last 10 years or so. The explosion in vegan cuisine and vegan restaurants, and the excuses that meat eaters or vegetarians have are getting less relevant by the day. I mean, by the I could never eat that because it doesn't taste the same, or it doesn't taste as good, or it doesn't taste good. The alternatives and the substitutes now are they barely taste any different. They barely Meat substitutes. People can barely tell the difference now. Okay, cheese still needs to be figured out, but it's getting even cheese is getting better all the time. Better all the time. The vegan cheeses are pretty good now. Not as good, but they're almost there. So I think those kind of excuses are becoming less relevant. And so, I try and do my bit to talk about it hopefully without being, preachy or coming across as belligerent.
My last question for you is that you are 57, rapidly creeping up on 60. How would you
Mhm.
describe your mission as a musician as you approach that milestone?
It's really odd. I mean, in some ways, I can barely believe that I am 57 because I feel like I'm just starting to make good records, or maybe I've been making records that I think are good for a bit longer than that. But I've reflected on this many times, and maybe we've talked about this before, that many of the musicians that we grew up um, admiring, being influenced by, being inspired by, essentially made most of their great work in their 20s. And something's changed in the sense that I think a lot of musicians now are really coming into their own in their 40s, 50s, or even older and making great music, um, at a sort of a later stage in their life. And I feel like I'm one of those people. I feel like I'm doing my best work. And most of the musicians I grew up admiring kind of were coasting by the time they got to their mid 30s, naming no names. But I think a lot of the musicians that we think of from the classic rock tradition, for example, most of them produced their great work in their 20s. I don't know if you'd agree with me or not with that, but that's the way it seems to me. And then spent most of the rest of their career, their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, kind of trading off that work they did in their 20s. And the music I made in my 20s is not something I care to remember particularly fondly. So I guess I was a bit of a slow starter. And as you say, I find myself careering now to 60, and I feel like I'm, just getting to my peak in a way, which is good. I think I'm happy it's that way around, to be honest. I think there must be nothing worse than producing great work in your 20s and then wondering where all the magic disappeared to. What I call the Citizen Kane syndrome. When Citizen Kane is your first movie, where do you go from there? It's tough. It destroys people. Obviously, it does.